Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Serene Slabbert from Peace Humane, and I will be your host today for the first Compassion for All Humane Education event here in Canada. It's a free online event, and it's organized to promote ethical humane education options for school staff, daycares, homeschool groups, and parents. Before we get started with our first presenters, we would like to begin to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and ceded territory of the Katzie First Nations and the Coast Salish peoples.
Well, thank you so much for having us and letting us sort of work with you to launch the beginning of a Compassion for All. My name is Stephanie Itle-Clark, and I'm the founder and president of the Academy of Prosocial Learning and the incoming president of the Humane Education Coalition. I'm also a classroom teacher, a certified classroom teacher. So I'm really excited by the group that's come together today. We have all sorts of formal and informal educators who are obviously working to promote a more compassionate and equitable world. And now, Erin, if you want to do your introduction.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Comaskey. I have had the pleasure of working with Dr. Itle-Clark for almost 15 years now. I am also a former classroom teacher and in fact did spend almost 5 years in Canada as well, working in Montreal, but also spending summers in the Maritimes with First Nation learners, with the Mi'kmaq First Nations people for several summers while we were living in Canada. So I'm extremely excited to be with folks from around Canada. I currently live in the Netherlands. Maybe you can see I've moved around quite a bit. I work as an educational consultant, both with Stephanie's organization. I'm also a board member of the Humane Education Coalition, and I'm currently working as a teaching assistant at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Education.
Thanks, Erin. And she forgot to leave out, she also recently earned her doctorate in education as well. So congratulations.
Thank you.
We are absolutely thrilled to be here. We believe that in the underpinning of humane education, we believe it's vital in order to create the idea of compassion that truly is for all. And we know that humane education that's an underpinning does not come into existence by being like a standalone program or something that only happens as a one-off. It needs to be connected to the realities of life, family, and community. And we also believe that humane education is strongest when it's intertwined with relevant personal experiences. So that's kind of the lens from which we are coming today and that we'll share and discuss with you. Now, we know humane education isn't new, but it has fluctuated in its circle of influence, and it has not always been truly inclusive in regards to recognizing the interconnections among the social movements. In fact, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, there were humane education programs, but they were programs that helped people learn to save the victims of drowning. And that's what the Royal Humane Society offered, that type of humane education program. So at the Academy of Prosocial Learning, we take the inclusive approach and we use the definition that you see on the screen. It's education that encourages cognitive, affective, and behavioral growth. So right, the head, the heart, and the hands of learning through personal development of critical thinking, problem solving, perspective taking, and empathy as it relates to people, animals, and the planet and the intersections among them. We believe that education, when taught through a humane lens, goes beyond the gathering of knowledge. It helps learners to truly process their personal values. We think that that's very important. We also see education as becoming less anthropocentric when that happens, right? Less human focused. And this will hopefully move learners toward a more ecocentric mindset, or one that's focused on the value of the whole ecosphere, right? Where all living beings have inherent value and are allowed to live their life as they are intended. And so this juxtaposes the view in which the human need is the core purpose. It changes that so that the core purpose of each being is their place, their natural resource, right? Or in instance of humans, like their humanity. And we can trace the expansion of humane education throughout history, right? And the history of humane education, as we now embrace it, has grown throughout the decades alongside other important social movements. And we wanted to mention that because obviously of the times that we're living in, and Erin's going to go into some of that about why we need humane education more than ever. And we know that these social movements include child protection movements and the women's rights movements of the late 1800s, the early 1900s, various planetary protections that's, really blossomed in the 60s through now, and the growing inclusive social justice movements of today. Humane education, as we defined it, and as we're moving forward, we want it to become an even more comprehensive and even more inclusive methodology to create a more peaceful and equitable world. And so I'm going to turn it over to Erin now, now that I've kind of defined where we're coming from, and she's going to kind of build off of that idea of what kind of world we can create and why we need it.
Thank you, Stephanie. What I think the history of humane education shows us is that during times of great social change, the response always includes an examination and ultimately a transformation within our education systems. In this current crisis, one of the key realizations is the universal experience of a pandemic. Here I am sitting in the Netherlands, Stephanie's sitting in the United States, you folks, many of you are sitting in Canada. Lockdowns, masks, hybrid learning models, Zoom calls, virtual conferences, these are all adjustments that have been made by people across the globe. And similarly, we see a common experience of people understanding or minimally appreciating our connection to all other living beings on the planet. Forced opportunity to stay home maybe has made us appreciate more the changes in the weather, for example, birdsong, things you might not have noticed when you were going about your very busy, regular, normal existence, now has become kind of heightened. That experience has become heightened. The arrival of spring, for example. And sometimes also what has become heightened are the things that we don't have the ability to do, like the ability to travel, the ability to visit family. I know that has been something personally that I have had to struggle with. And this maybe has resulted in increased isolation and loneliness. Now, not surprisingly, this isolation has led to many folks seeking of companionship in non-human animals, right? So folks are kind of realizing our connection to non-human animals in a way that perhaps they haven't before. Adoptions and fostering of companion animals has surged within North America and across Europe, in some cases emptying shelters completely. And I know in my own experience in the Netherlands, folks are getting outdoors much more frequently and kind of communing with wild animals and nature in general. Furthermore, we've seen predictions around a significant drop in meat consumption around the globe, highlighting a potential for our changed relationship between ourselves, the way we eat, the way we live. So in some, across the globe, universally, people are having a real lived experience of how our well-being physically and mentally is dependent upon the well-being of those who are different from us, including non-human animals and plant life. So this pandemic has brought into sharp focus the realization that no life is exempt from the consequences of our misuse, mistreatment, and misunderstandings of our plant and animal counterparts. For educators, models of success for returning to school, best practices for virtual learning, and an intentional focus on, I think, social and emotional support for students and also for teachers is also crossing boundaries. We're seeing this kind of coming together across the globe of community and best practice. Early on, the website Edutopia, which many of you might be familiar with, surveyed educators worldwide to spark conversations on how schools and teachers were adapting their new normal, new way of practicing to meet the needs of their students. Now, of course, while practices and approaches varied widely, what was true across the board was educators' commitment to providing their students with the best experience possible and attending to their well-being. This kind of new understanding that social and emotional learning was maybe more than just this add-on that had kind of become this new buzzword in education. They were feeling the importance of kind of mental health, student voice, teacher voice in practice in a very real way. And so in times of change, which we are living in right now, education systems are often on the front line of response, and this period, of course, is no exception. So what does this mean for humane education now? Stephanie, thank you. The realities of our environmental crisis, of social justice, and animal care have been evident to many of us, I'm sure, for decades. But what is different now, I think, is that the pandemic has provided us with this tipping point where we as a human society can clearly see how our existence is truly interdependent with our plant and non-human animal life. And moreover, educators are recognizing with new vigor the critical need for greater empathy, greater compassion, and greater action to be taken for our survival. Helena Peterson and Richard Kahn, which are two of my favorite authors who address eco-pedagogy and as well as animal protection themes in their work, among other authors, have pointed to what Peterson has referred to as the hidden curriculum in our education system. And this hidden curriculum refers to one that kind of stops short of rocking the boat. So it fits into our traditional model where we can bring in kind of controversial topics or topics that might be deemed controversial, but only to a certain point. So even in some untraditional forms of education, it brings learners kind of to the water, but doesn't force them to drink. So they're learning about maybe determining and deciphering dilemmas in our society, but the educational experience itself remains ineffective, willfully or not, at helping learners to actively consider plant and animal perspective in their living system. So in other words, even with the inclusion of environmental education, for example, these pedagogical approaches kind of prop up a traditional framework that keeps humans apart and separate and exceptional to the systems in which they function. But now, because of our kind of inescapable need to change, we're seeing this hidden curriculum crumble slightly. And ironically, despite the mandates to remain physically separate from each other, many are experiencing this new connection to plant and animal life. And so what we're seeing in response to the need for online learning and virtual schooling, we see kind of these two phenomena emerge. First, learning is no longer bound by a physical space, and in some cases, time, right? So we have asynchronous learning versus synchronous learning. We don't have to be in one building all the time to be learning. So this has kind of freed up the way that we can envision schooling. It also means we see an uptick in our desire to give students experiences outdoors. Any of you who have children yourself know that they need to be outside, being physically active. And if you've had students in on a rainy day, for example, right, we're like, please. I know, and in Canada, it's really wonderful. What I experience is no matter the weather, students went outside. It's not so much the case across the United States and in other parts of the world. But I think in my experience, the Canadian schooling system did a really great job kind of getting students outdoors regularly. But within this crisis, we have even more of an opportunity to allow learning to occur outdoors, not just planned activities that involve interactions with nature, but just being outside to learn. The convergence of social, planetary, and animal issues occurs much more naturally when students have the opportunity to be embedded in their natural environment. last month, Ed Week, I don't know if any of you are kind of on LinkedIn and follow along some of the feeds, but Ed Week highlighted the impact that these opportunities to move schooling outside when and where possible has a particular impact on, of course, all students, but particularly students who are considered disadvantaged or come from traditionally urban areas where their opportunity to be in nature, it may be limited. So the beginning of the article read, in Oregon, where Black students make up only 5% of the student body, this particular program, Camp ELSO, is working on introducing students of color to a multicultural approach for STEM education, from gathering in gardens, playing with plant-based dyes, and cooking up vegan meals. Small groups of Portland youngsters of color were introduced to science in their community. So these students were kind of tying in this STEM component to gain visibility for Black and brown kids in the area of science and math, but also connecting them to their environment in a way that they hadn't had the opportunity before. And what we know from this kind of work is that connecting students to nature can, of course, positively impact academic learning outcomes, but it also has a strong impact on social and emotional well-being. By taking children, particularly children in urban environments, and making the outdoors relevant to their lived experience, we create a sense of ownership and responsibility between the learner and their natural world. And this is the first step in improving learning outcomes for students across all domains. Stephanie mentioned the head, the heart, and the hands. We're going to talk about that probably a few more times during this session. But it's really important as we address the whole learner that they feel that they are kind of being addressed in all ways possible. And this sense of ownership and connection to community leads us to the second phenomenon that the pandemic has created. We're seeing in a new way a question of the purpose of education. So the Harvard School of Education, Fernando Reimers, has recently put out a couple of new books, but in his most recent one called Education for Children to Improve the World, he addresses specifically this need for stronger civic engagement and greater global connection for students to be competent in addressing 21st century challenges. So in a turn kind of away from the last 30 years in education in North America, and certainly reform in the United States, Reimers is suggesting that education shouldn't be looked at only as a means to an economic outcome. And this competitiveness, this kind of global competitiveness that has been such the focus, is really detrimental for these up and coming generations of learners who need to create a better world. So the competitiveness is kind of undermining what we ultimately need to achieve, which is a better future. So the idea of civic responsibility, of course, is deeply rooted in the history of humane education. As Stephanie mentioned, as she was discussing the history of humane education, we see this strong connection between humane education's development and civic commitment. And now we're seeing this new social movement, one that's not only focused on people, one with the full realization that transformation of any system, whether it be education system or some other system, really isn't going to be effective without the consideration and accommodation of plant and animal life. So as Stephanie mentioned, I did just finish my dissertation, so it wouldn't be fair if I didn't mention it here. In my dissertation work, one of my focuses was to connect the work that we do in humane education through global understanding. And it was to kind of focus in on a potential to connect, understand, and revere all plant and animal life, and mandates that we break down walls of geography and culture and come together with our universal vision for a better future as a society. So clearly this is kind of a transformation of lots of current thinking, but we are indeed in the middle of a transformative period. And what Stephanie, thanks Stephanie, you're ahead of me and put the perfect slide up. What you're seeing here is the transformational learning theory. And this global state of affairs that we've been talking about is what Mesereau, who is the founder theory for transformational learning. He might refer to this state of affairs as a disorienting dilemma. This is where we're faced with a truth that we previously did not see or did not want to see. And in response, our systems, our personal systems and our systems at large go through the difficult but ultimately rewarding process of creating change. So what this little model shows us, and there's others on the web, so if it's something that is of interest to you, just go ahead and Google it. You'll find some other models up there. But whether we like it or not, we're going through this process of transformation. So we're faced with the reality that our lives and that of other animals and planets are deeply intertwined. And we're faced with this urgent need to help students develop empathy to all life so that they can shape their future for the better. So thankfully, humane education offers a framework to support these new realizations. Deep learning that is transformative in nature and is rooted in positive outcomes for the entire community, is truly one that is humane. There's never been a more appropriate or critical time for a humane lens in our transformation. Stephanie, can you pop the next slide? Thank you. So the timing is right for humane education to be applied on a wider scale than it has been to this point in our history. This disorienting dilemma has provided a perfect opportunity for us as a society to adopt these new values and kind of align our personal and professional lives as educators with these deep understandings. So how does this apply in a real world setting of teaching and learning? So as we kind of touched on, traditional learning models based on competition, economic outputs, really don't address appropriately 21st century challenges that our young people will be facing in their futures, specifically climate, humanitarian, and animal crises. So if education is really to fulfill its promise, then teaching and learning through a humane lens becomes the most viable option. And shortly, Stephanie is going to discuss what that would look like in practice, touching a little bit on our proposal for humane pedagogy. But first, I want to put your minds at ease about how this lens is achieved in early childhood and younger grades. So I know some of you might be thinking right now, I teach kindergarten or I have a preschooler at home. This all seems a bit heavy. How does this make sense for me? And I do get that. I have a toddler at home and I have an 11-year-old. So I have to worry about a whole range of issues and in terms of how I would present those issues to various age groups. So my classroom career, however, has always been in early childhood, pre-K through grade 3. And what those children taught me was that they're wired to learn from a humane lens. And that is, they learn best when taught through the head, the heart, and the hands. So when you're addressing those 3 areas, as many of you practitioners already probably recognize as the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains, this is precisely the approach that a humane education would take. All a humane lens requires is that you approach teaching and learning through appealing to things that the children feel something about, and to create natural learning outcomes and allowing them plenty of chances to practice their skills. These are reflected in what Stephanie and I refer to as the dimensions of humane education, and that's what's on the slide right now. So the first thing that you can see from this graphic is that there should be balance between the human, animal, and environmental perspective. And it's important to try, when possible, to kind of thread the needle between each of these components into whatever content you're teaching. And then when we think about the dimensions, I know they're looking here like a hierarchy, one after the other, but it's not exactly. It's just a means of kind of determining where your learners might be in that cycle, and then stretching or scaffolding their learning experience through those dimensions. It's cyclical in nature, as many of you probably already know. And another piece, and maybe the more critical piece to remember, is that part of this process, an integral part of this process, is active and critical reflection. So no matter where you may be in the dimension cycle, having students think about their mental maps, their schemas, and their process during any of the learning activities they're working on will deepen and strengthen their learning, as well as help decide what the next steps may be. So these dimensions were created based on reviews of elements of social justice and environmental education, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that later on. Stephanie, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a little bit more about application in higher education.
All right, thanks, Erin. And I mean, when we talk about obviously the differences between early childhood and then like high school or higher education, we know that there's obviously a developmental difference, but we also recognize that certain things are universal, right? So when Erin talks about educating with the cognitive, affective, or psychomotor, the head, heart, and hands, that doesn't end after a certain age, right? We don't turn 18 and suddenly we don't need to care about what we're learning. And so as Erin described, we're seeing a call for education reform at all levels that include all of these aspects of humane education and humane pedagogy. And, we get super excited about this topic, and we could talk for a really long time. We won't make you listen to it, but we could talk to you for hours about humane pedagogy and hopefully get you super excited about how education is reforming and how that hidden curriculum can change, not just in the kind of direct instruction, but also in the variety of practitioner training programs that are out there, whether that's informal programming or formal programming. And the type of education that inclusive humane education calls for, it doesn't devalue the human component. And I know Erin mentioned that, right? It doesn't make the human component of the equation in learning any less valuable. Instead, we need it because it strengthens that interrelationship. It's ecocentric, right? In the way it supports interspecies justice for the human and the non-human world. There is a growth in social emotional learning that has been moving forward for a time now, but we definitely are seeing more and more because of things like the pandemic. And this is both in formal and informal education programs. For example, if you do a quick search online, you can find descriptions of these programs that are talking about nurturing compassion, leadership, conflict resolution, self-awareness, mental wellness, right? Awareness, resilience, grit, right? There's all sorts of words out there that people are looking to help our learners of all ages build, whether that's elementary, early childhood, or even university level. And the one thing that stands out is that many of these programs, though, do remain anthropocentric, right? The scenarios, even though they're teaching these core skills that Erin showed on the dimensions, they're not always including all of the components that she shared at the top. The scenarios rarely are going to include the environmental or non-human animal perspective. And this is where we can embrace that truly transformative component that is humane education, right? That is true prosocial education. And we're at that time in history where we need this humane pedagogy to build that bridge to animal welfare and connect it to the other social justice reforms in education so that we can strengthen social change movements in order to really achieve them. And the one thing that we find to be imperative in teaching and learning through humane pedagogy, and I think the higher up the ladder we go, the more important it even gets, is to help our children recognize positive and negative power systems. We could talk again a whole other session about why we need to teach our learners to see both positive and negative components in the world. But I would sum it up, say that if we only teach our learners, especially at the secondary level, to only see the inequities or the negative systems and systemic issues in our world, we're not teaching them to celebrate each other. We're not teaching them to celebrate the things that have been accomplished, and we're not teaching them how to build upon the positive things that are already there. So that's something that we believe is truly important in humane education, right? So why do we need it? All the things we've talked about, but also to help people connect with the positives in society. I think right now, humane education needs to bring that to people. And as we all work toward this idea of community, of building relationships, it's important that we have the ability to tell each other, hey, I don't agree with you completely, but I really appreciate what has been done so far. Can we build on it? Without that positive reinforcement, I unfortunately feel that humane education is going to continue to spin its wheels, and individuals who we are approaching will be less likely to embrace any of the reform or any of the levels of change. Now, we spent some of our time today giving examples, again, of younger learners, and we do know that learning is a lifelong process. And so we wanted to share with you, you're the first group we've actually shared it kind of publicly with, other than just on social media. There's a new book that we contributed to called Humane Education in Higher Education, Advancing Inclusive Social Justice Strategies in a Post-Secondary Environment. And this book brings together over 12 scholar practitioners who are bringing humane education and humane pedagogy themes to the university level, right? And this ranges from people who are suggesting reforms to teacher education, to sociology, criminal justice, scientific careers, and there's even a chapter dedicated to the way that the campus itself can support humane education and humane activities through things like what the cafeteria offers, the way groundkeeping is done. We know that sustainability and pro-social education is not just another issue that needs to be added to schooling, to an overcrowded curriculum. It's actually a gateway to a different view of curriculum, a different way of educating, of organizing change, and of creating a new ethos. So, we feel humane education, why humane education? That was our session. Why aren't we already doing it? It's almost a better question, because all of us can see the connections, the hidden curriculum components that need to be reformed. We need to continue to band together to show others, right, by telling them what that is being done well and how they can build on it, right? How to bring humane pedagogy to the broader informal and formal education realms. So I'm going to give it back to Erin for just a few moments before our Q&A. I can't wait to see what questions you have and to get to know you better.
So just a kind of final note, something to take away as kind of in summary of all the things that we've been talking about. As we move forward from today, I hope you enjoy the remainder of the sessions. They're going to be amazing. But as you kind of move into your educational setting, whether that's an informal setting at home, a preschool, daycare setting, a formal classroom, whatever your education setting may be, what are the things that you want to think about in terms of how can I apply humane education to my classroom tomorrow? So think about, number one, humane education is something that works in tandem with your community, and it addresses issues of relevance and of need. So humane education isn't a separate set of curriculum demands that you need to achieve in a linear manner. Humane education is something that is deeply embedded within your own community. So what are the needs of your community right now that are facing your non-human animal counterparts, your environmental counterparts, and your students? Number two, humane education meets learners where they are, and it addresses all aspects of learning, right? Head, heart, and hands is probably the easiest takeaway from today. Your students don't have to be at a certain point in their learning in order to take a humane lens. They don't have to be exposed to something that you might think is highly controversial. It's all about kind of meeting students where they are. As we know, kids are amazingly observant. They pick up on tensions, they pick up on the way people are feeling. And sometimes just starting with that conversation, how's everybody feeling today and why? That might be a good place to gauge where your learners are and where you might want to start some conversations around adopting that humane lens. And number 3 is maybe the easiest thing to take away, second to head, heart, and hands, is that a humane education's primary goal is to move learners from total anthropocentrism, where it's all about you and the ego, to a more ecocentric individual, right? So somebody who really is concerned about the well-being of the planet and everything that holds on to, right? So it's about moving from a kind of very highly prioritized sense of self to a higher prioritized sense of otherness. And so as long as you're kind of moving in that direction, even with baby steps, you're taking a humane approach to education. So those are kind of the 3 takeaways that Stephanie and I wanted to leave you with. Stephanie, we can move on to the next slide. And just before we kind of move on to our question period, Stephanie and I would like to thank you all so much for joining us today. We were so happy to be invited and to be here with all of you. And of course, your interest in humane education. And as we move forward with our various learning environments, and we will undoubtedly be preparing to move through these anthropocentric systems towards a more bio and ecocentric lens. And we hope we will be partners in securing a safe and peaceful future for our planet. So we happily take any questions that you all may have. And thanks again.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. I do have one question. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Is there, I know through the Academy of Prosocial Learning, there is online learning options for continuing education, for learning more on teaching humane education and other options on there. But is there any resources for teachers and parents for class plans or school curriculums that are more inclusive in this way that you two might be able to share? Is it available anywhere online?
One of the best places to look would definitely be the Humane Education Coalition Toolkit. On that webpage, if you just search Humane Education Coalition and then Toolkit, it will take you to a page that has resources brought in from a lot of other organizations. And we take a comprehensive and inclusive lens at the coalition. So those are usually our partner organizations that are listed there.
Amazing. So thank you.
And that is free. That's always the follow-up question we get. We're like, how? That's free. Yeah, you can go to the coalition. There's no cost to download those things.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time. This has been so amazing to watch. I know I've taken some of your classes as well, Stephanie, so it's kind of fun to absorb some of that again. So I'm very excited for what both of you are doing, and I really much appreciate both of you coming online and doing this talk for us. So on our website, there is links to both the Academy of Prosocial Learning, as well as the Humane Education Coalition, which you're both a part of. So if anybody wants to reach out with any more questions, please do so to Erin and Stephanie directly. And yeah, I hope you both have an amazing day further, and we'll be in touch.
Right, you
Thanks
as
so
well.
much.
We
Have
can't
a great
wait
day,
to see
everyone.
the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Enjoy your conference. Take care.
Bye.